Before we speak of legions marching across the Rhine, before we speak of auxiliaries bloodying the deserts of Syria or the marshes of Britannia, before we speak of walls and watchtowers and disciplined formations crashing like iron waves against the shore of civilization, we must first speak of the men who stood closest to power. The men who slept within earshot of Rome's most powerful heartbeat. The men whose armored presence filled doorways in the dead of night, whose loyalty was purchased with gold and privilege, and the cold, unspoken promise that they alone decided who lived and who died at the very center of the known world. We must speak of the Praetorians. They were not simply bodyguards. That word is far too small. A bodyguard watches a door and hopes nothing happens. The Praetorian Guard was something else. A political instrument, a military force, a philosophical statement written in steel and blood. They were the answer to a question Rome's emperors asked themselves in their most honest, most sleepless moments. In a world where any man with a blade and proximity to power could end an empire, who do you trust to stand beside you? The answer, it turned out, was complicated. The origins of the Praetorian Guard reach back before the emperors themselves, back into the fevered final decades of the Republic, when Roman generals maintained personal escort units during military campaigns. These cohors praetoriae, named for the praetorium, the general's tent at the center of every Roman camp, were select soldiers whose job was to protect the commander from the chaos of battle and from the ambitions of rivals. Julius Caesar had such men. Pompey had such men. They were tools of war. But when Octavian, later Augustus, transformed the Republic into the empire and himself into the first princeps, the nature of these escort cohorts transformed as well. What had been a field formation became something permanent, something institutional, something that would endure in various forms for over 3 centuries. Augustus established the Guard formally around 27 BCE. He created 9 cohorts, each containing somewhere between 500 and 1,000 men, drawn from the finest soldiers the Roman military machine could produce. 3 of those cohorts were stationed in Rome itself, quartered in the houses of private citizens and in various barracks spread throughout the city. A deliberate understatement, a careful performance of normalcy meant to reassure a city that had been traumatized by decades of civil war. The remaining cohorts were stationed in towns surrounding Rome, close enough to respond, distant enough not to terrify. Augustus was careful. Augustus was always careful. He understood that the open display of military force within Rome's sacred boundary, the Pomerium, carried dangerous symbolic weight. So he spread his enforcers quietly across the city and its outskirts, letting their presence be felt without being nakedly seen. But this careful arrangement would not survive the first generation. Under Tiberius, the second emperor, the Guard underwent a transformation that would define its character for the rest of its existence. The architect of this change was a man named Lucius Aelius Sejanus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard, and one of the most dangerous human beings the ancient world ever produced. Sejanus was not emperor. He never held the purple. But for a period stretching through the late reign of the aging, increasingly paranoid Tiberius, Sejanus exercised power that rivaled and perhaps exceeded that of the man he technically served. He concentrated the Guard's scattered cohorts into a single massive barracks complex on the northeastern edge of Rome, the Castra Praetoria. This consolidation was presented as a practical measure, a matter of military efficiency and improved morale. It was, in reality, a seizure of strategic position. Suddenly, thousands of the best armed, best paid, most loyally bound soldiers in the empire lived together in one fortified compound, within walking distance of the Senate, the Forum, and the imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill. Sejanus had placed the knife on the table. Everyone could see it. The Praetorians were paid significantly more than ordinary legionaries. A common soldier on the frontier earned perhaps 900 sesterces per year. A Praetorian guardsman earned 3 times that, sometimes more, with additional bonuses, gifts, and donatives that could swell their income to extraordinary levels. They served shorter terms, 16 years rather than 25, and retired with generous cash settlements. They wore better equipment, carried finer arms, and occupied a social position that blurred the line between soldier and courtier. They were the emperor's men, and they knew it, and everyone around them knew it, and the knowledge of their position colored every interaction they had with the world. What did they look like? These men who terrified the empire's political classes. Distinctive. Deliberately, consciously distinctive. While legionary soldiers marched in segmented plate armor, the lorica segmentata that has become the defining visual shorthand for Roman military might. In the modern imagination, the Praetorians wore something older, something more deliberately intimidating. Their armor referenced Attic Greek styling, muscled breastplates with sculpted physiques pressed in bronze over their chests, capes and plumes and decorative embellishments that spoke not of functional battlefield pragmatism, but of ceremony and menace. Their shields bore the scorpion emblem, the symbol of Capricorn, Augustus's birth sign, worked in gold on a field of deep red and white. They moved through Rome like a different species of soldier, elevated, self-conscious, aware that their presence was itself a form of communication. That communication was clear. This is what power looks like. This is what it can do to you. The political role of the Guard became explicit with shocking speed. The Emperor Caligula, erratic, terrifying, increasingly untethered from reality as his brief reign progressed, was assassinated in 41 CE by a conspiracy that included Praetorian officers. The lead conspirator was a tribune named Cassius Chaerea, a man whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated in public, forcing him to adopt embarrassing watchwords and mocking his voice before the court. Chaerea's vengeance was swift and overwhelming. Caligula was stabbed more than 30 times in a palace corridor, his wife murdered, his infant daughter's skull smashed against a wall by soldiers who understood that incomplete purges breed future complications. What followed was a moment that exposed the raw truth the Praetorians represented. As senators debated whether to restore the Republic, actually debated it in the immediate aftermath of the killing in the corridors of power, Praetorian soldiers searching the palace found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain, paralyzed with terror. And they made him emperor, not because the Senate voted, not because the gods ordained, because the Guard decided. They carried Claudius to their barracks on their shoulders, surrounded him with their bodies, and informed the Roman world that this was the new princeps. The Senate, as usual, confirmed what had already been determined elsewhere. It was the first time the Guard made an emperor. It would not be the last. The year 69 CE, the year of the 4 emperors, demonstrated what happened when Praetorian loyalty became genuinely available for purchase. After Nero's death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the Guard supported Galba, then murdered him when he proved insufficiently generous with donatives. They elevated Otho, who had promised them wealth, and marched with him against Vitellius, and when Otho lost, they transferred their loyalties again with the comfortable flexibility of men who understood that their value lay in their capacity for violence rather than in any personal devotion to the men they nominally protected. The empire cycled through emperors with nauseating speed, and at the center of each transition, visible or invisible, were the Praetorians. The nadir, the moment when the Guard's commodification of imperial power reached its most obscene expression, came in 193 CE. After murdering the Emperor Pertinax, who had attempted to impose military discipline and reduce the Guard's special privileges, the Praetorians quite literally auctioned the throne. The richest bidder would become master of the Roman world. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus showed up at the Castra Praetoria's walls with promises of staggering sums and outbid his only rival. The soldiers shouted their approval. He was emperor. He lasted 66 days before the legions on the frontier, disgusted, marched on Rome under Septimius Severus, who entered the city, disbanded the existing Praetorian Guard entirely, sent them away stripped of their weapons and their prestige and their comfortable lives, and reformed the Guard with his own loyal troops from the Danubian legions. Severus understood something fundamental. The Praetorians were not merely a security service, they were a symbol, a statement about where real power resided. By replacing them wholesale with frontier soldiers, men who had actually fought, who bore the scars of real campaigns, he was communicating something to Rome and to the empire's political classes. He was saying, "The edge of the world is what forges men. Not the marble corridors of palaces, not the comfortable barracks within the city, the frontier, the rain and the mud and the enemy's blade. That is where power is born." The Guard continued, reformed and reshaped, through the chaotic 3rd century. They made and unmade emperors with exhausting regularity. They became, in the words of the historian Cassius Dio, a continuous danger to the state, their loyalty available to the highest bidder, their violence as likely to be turned against their masters as deployed on their behalf. They were finally definitively abolished by Constantine the Great in 312 CE, following the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Constantine's opponent, Maxentius, had relied on the Praetorians. Constantine defeated him, and then, with the methodical satisfaction of a man closing a chapter of history that had long since stopped serving any legitimate purpose, Constantine disbanded the Guard, destroyed their barracks, and scattered the survivors to distant postings at the empire's fringes. 3 centuries of terror, of palace murder, of political manipulation, of soldiers who had forgotten the difference between protecting power and exercising it, ended at last. But while they existed, while they stood in their sculpted breastplates and their scorpion-emblazoned shields in the corridors and anterooms of imperial Rome, they represented something genuinely unprecedented in the history of organized violence. They were soldiers who had mastered the art of proximity. And proximity, in politics as in violence, is everything. There is a particular kind of dangerous man that most people never consider when they think about military might. They imagine young men, strong men, men in the full vigor of their youth, arms thick with muscle, reflexes sharp as the blades they carry. Armies built from the energetic raw material of the world's young population, harvested, shaped, deployed. They are not wrong to imagine this. The Roman legions were, in their core composition, built exactly that way. Young men recruited in their teens and early 20s, trained with extraordinary rigor, marched across the known world, hardened into instruments of imperial violence. But there was another kind of soldier Rome could call upon. Older men. Men who had already served their full term, 25 years of marching and building and fighting and surviving, and then chose, for reasons that require some psychological unpacking, to go back, to strap on the armor again, to march again, to fight again. Not because they had to, because some part of them could not conceive of themselves outside of the military context that had shaped their entire adult existence. These were the evocati, and they terrified the ancient world in a way that youth and strength alone cannot explain. The word evocati means literally the called back or the summoned. They were veterans who had completed their service and been honorably discharged, missi honesta missione, and who were then asked by a general or by the emperor himself to return to the colors. The request was framed as an honor, as a recognition of exceptional service, as an acknowledgement that their experience was irreplaceable. And it was all of those things, but it was also a transaction. The evocati received significant privileges in exchange for their continued service. They were exempt from the heavy manual labor that consumed enormous portions of a regular legionary's time. The ditch digging, the road building, the fortification construction, the endless physical infrastructure work that made Roman armies the unparalleled builders as well as fighters of the ancient world. They were exempt from the most menial duties. They carried a special staff, the vites or centurion's rod in some contexts, that marked their status. They were treated within the military hierarchy as men who had already proven everything that needed proving. What they brought to the battlefield was something that cannot be manufactured through training alone. Experience. Not just familiarity with weapons and formations and the tactical vocabulary of Roman warfare. Though they had all of that in quantities dwarfing what any young soldier could claim, they brought something deeper. They had already faced death and survived. They had already experienced the particular quality of terror that comes from standing in a shield wall while the enemy charges, from hearing the screaming and feeling the ground shake, and knowing, with every animal instinct screaming at you to flee, that you cannot hold. They had learned to master that terror, and once learned, that mastery does not leave. Their courage was not the courage of inexperience, the reckless adrenaline-fueled rush of men who have not yet fully comprehended what they are walking into. Their courage was the harder, colder, more deliberate variety, the courage of men who know exactly what is coming and choose to stand anyway. Julius Caesar made notable use of recalled veterans during his Gallic campaigns and the civil wars. Caesar understood instinctively the value of experienced men. He referred to his veteran soldiers with familial intimacy unusual for commanders of his era, calling them commilitones, fellow soldiers, rather than the distancing miles. He understood that men who had fought beside him through multiple campaigns represented an investment of shared experience that could not be replaced from the recruitment pool. When he needed reliable formations for critical moments, he turned to his veterans. The most famous instance came during the assault on Alesia in 52 BCE, one of the most audacious operations in ancient history, in which Caesar besieged Vercingetorix's massive Gallic force while simultaneously building a second ring of circumvallation to keep a relief army from breaking through. Caesar was besieging while being besieged, a situation requiring every soldier to perform at the highest level under sustained pressure. When the relief army attacked from outside and the garrison attacked from within simultaneously, threatening to overwhelm the Roman works, it was the veterans who held, who found the reserves of experience and self-mastery to continue functioning when the situation appeared genuinely catastrophic. The evocati were, in a very real sense, a standing rebuke to the assumption that military value declines with age. Roman warfare was not primarily a contest of individual physical athleticism. It was a contest of collective discipline, of tactical awareness, of the ability to maintain formation integrity under pressure, of raw nerve. All of these qualities improve with experience rather than diminishing with it. The veteran soldier who has learned to read a battlefield, who has learned to identify the moment when an enemy formation is beginning to waver, who has learned to manage his own fear without letting it paralyze his decisions, who has learned the dozen small tricks of survival that no training manual can fully capture, is, in many critical respects, more valuable than a physically stronger but inexperienced young soldier. The Romans were not sentimental about this. They were pragmatic to the bone. They recognized value where they found it, and they consistently found it in their veterans. The institution of the evocati was a formal acknowledgement of this recognition. It built into the Roman military system a mechanism for retaining and redeploying the most expensive and valuable resource that system produced: the fully formed, completely experienced, psychologically tempered fighting man who had already proven everything that could be proven. There is another dimension to the evocati that deserves consideration. These men were, almost by definition, deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of Roman military life. 25 years is a long time, longer than the portion of life most people spend in any single context. The men who served their full term had spent their entire adult lives within the Roman military's unique society. They spoke its language, shared its rituals, understood its hierarchies, lived by its values. For many, the prospect of civilian life, returning to a village where nobody understood what they had experienced, where the intense bonds of shared danger had no equivalent, where their expertise was irrelevant, was profoundly disorienting. For some, the callback was an act of psychological rescue, as much as military recruitment. It gave them back the context in which they made sense, the identity that felt most fundamentally theirs. To the enemy, to the Gallic warrior, the Germanic tribesman, the Parthian horseman, there was something uniquely unsettling about facing men like these. Young soldiers carry in their movements the evidence of their inexperience. Their eyes betray fear, even when they hold their line. But the veterans of the evocati moved differently. They had the economy of motion that comes only from having performed an action thousands of times until it requires no conscious thought. Their faces, weathered and scarred and utterly composed, communicated nothing useful to an enemy. No fear, no uncertainty, only the calm of men who had been in this exact kind of situation before and handled it before and would handle it again. That composure was its own form of weapon, unreadable, immovable, ancient. The Roman Empire was, at its greatest extent, a system of incorporated violence. It absorbed the peoples it conquered, yes. It absorbed their cultures, their gods, their languages, their agricultural techniques, their trade networks. But it also absorbed their ways of fighting. The Romans were not ideologically committed to any single method of warfare. They were committed to winning, and winning, in the complex military geography of an empire spanning 3 continents and dozens of distinct ecological and cultural zones, required flexibility. It required the ability to field soldiers who could fight in the deep forests of Germany and the baking flatlands of North Africa and the mountain passes of Anatolia. It required specialists. Enter the auxiliaries. The auxiliary units of the Roman military were non-citizen soldiers, drawn from the provinces, from client kingdoms, from the diverse populations that Rome had incorporated or subjugated over the centuries of expansion, who served alongside the citizen legions and brought capabilities that the citizen soldiers could not match. Over time, as Rome's military needs evolved and the empire's population became increasingly diverse, the auxiliaries grew from a supplementary force into something essential. They were not second-class soldiers. They were different-class soldiers, specialists whose value lay precisely in the things that made them unlike the standard legionary. Among the most feared of all Rome's auxiliary shock formations were the Batavians. The Batavi were a Germanic people who inhabited the island formed by the split mouth of the Rhine River, the region that corresponds roughly to the modern Netherlands. They had a peculiar and powerful relationship with Rome, one that combined military service with formal exemption from most forms of taxation and tribute. The Batavians did not pay Rome in the conventional ways. They paid in blood. Specifically, they provided elite military units, cavalry and infantry both, of extraordinary quality, and in exchange, they were treated as a military aristocracy within the empire's complex hierarchy of subject peoples. What made the Batavians terrifying, and the word is not too strong, was a combination of physical capability and tactical specialty that Rome's enemies consistently failed to account for. The Batavians were exceptional swimmers, exceptional not as a recreational accomplishment, but as a tactical weapon. They trained extensively in the ability to cross rivers under combat conditions, in full armor, carrying weapons, organized as formed units, capable of maintaining cohesion and fighting effectiveness from the moment they emerged from the water on the enemy's bank. This was not a capability that most ancient armies possessed or thought to cultivate. Rivers were, in the tactical thinking of most ancient commanders, natural barriers. You either bridged them with engineering, a time-consuming process that advertised your intentions clearly, or you crossed at fords which enemies could defend. The idea that an enemy formation could simply swim across a major river as a formed body and arrive ready to fight was so contrary to conventional military thinking that it could not be adequately defended against without specific foreknowledge. The Batavians exploited this advantage repeatedly. At the Thames crossing during the Claudian invasion of Britain in 43 CE, Batavian auxiliaries swam across in force while the defending Britons were still calculating how the Romans planned to bridge or ford the river. By the time the British chieftains understood what was happening, Batavian soldiers were already on their bank, already fighting, already tearing apart the defensive formation that had been so carefully arranged to repel a conventional crossing. The psychological shock was immense and immediate. An enemy who breaks your assumptions about what is possible has already won a portion of the battle before the first blade is drawn. The Batavians also provided extraordinary cavalry with a specific technique deployed in Roman military spectacle. They practiced swimming rivers on horseback, the rider and horse moving together across moving water, the rider often standing upright on the horse's back, balancing with the ease of men who had spent their lives developing this skill. In military demonstrations, this capability was displayed as theater, but the theater communicated real capability. The message was unmistakable. These men can come for you across water. No river protects you. From the east came other specialists with different capabilities. The Syrian archers, auxiliaries drawn primarily from Syria, Palestine, and the broader Levant, brought to the Roman military a tradition of archery technically superior to anything citizen legions could produce. Roman legionaries were not archers. They were shock infantry. Their weapons were the pilum, the heavy javelin thrown at the moment of contact to punch through shields and disrupt formations, and the gladius, the short stabbing sword for the close quarters press of the shield wall. But many enemies fought at range and required a ranged response. The Syrian archers provided it. They used composite bows, built from layered materials, horn and wood and sinew laminated together, to create a weapon dramatically more powerful than a simple wooden bow of comparable size. The composite bow could be built shorter, making it manageable for mounted archers while delivering more energy to the arrow. Syrian archers penetrated armor at ranges Roman-style archers could not match. They sustained fire that kept enemy formations pinned under a continuous rain of missiles, while legionary infantry maneuvered into position. They were, in the tactical vocabulary of Roman combined arms warfare, the artillery. Long-range suppression, creating conditions in which the hammer blows of the legions could land most effectively. But it was the Numidian cavalry that embodied most fully the auxiliaries' role as something genuinely alien to the Roman military's core aesthetic. The Numidians came from North Africa, modern Algeria and Tunisia, and they were cavalry in a style with no real Roman equivalent. They rode without saddles, without stirrups, controlling their horses with leg pressure and shifted weight and the subtle communication that comes from a lifetime of equestrian practice beginning in early childhood. They carried no shields. They wore minimal armor. They were light, fast, almost grotesquely mobile, and they were on open terrain, virtually impossible to catch or destroy by conventional means. The Numidian style was not the clash of shock cavalry. It was something more elusive, more psychologically wearing. They harassed. They appeared on flanks and rear areas, loosed javelins, and melted away before any organized response could reach them. They drew pursuing cavalry into ambushes. They cut supply lines and isolated detachments. They made an army feel constantly watched, constantly vulnerable. Roman legions campaigning without Numidian auxiliaries found themselves unable to protect their flanks or pursue a retreating enemy, which meant tactical victories could not be converted into strategic destruction. When Rome had Numidians fighting on its side, the balance shifted dramatically. Their ability to screen the legion's flanks, to pursue broken enemy formations, and to deny the enemy the same elusive mobility that made Numidian cavalry so dangerous was an enormous force multiplier. The genius of Rome's auxiliary system, at its best, was this: it didn't try to make everyone the same. It recognized that a Germanic tribesman who had grown up swimming rivers in formation brought skills that training alone could not replicate. That a Syrian boy who had drawn a composite bow since he could walk was, as an archer, superior to anything the Roman training system could produce in weeks of instruction. That a Numidian horseman who had learned to control a horse without saddle from earliest childhood inhabited a relationship with his animal that no amount of later instruction could fully duplicate. These things were the products of entire cultural systems, of childhoods and traditions, and accumulated folk knowledge refined over generations. Rome harvested all of it, and the empire's enemies, facing a force that could fight in any terrain and any style, faced something more than an army. They faced a system, and systems, unlike armies, are very hard to defeat. Imagine a line drawn around the Roman Empire at the height of its power. Start in the wet, cold northwest, on the shore of the North Sea, where Britannia's cliffs drop into gray water. Draw it south across the line of Hadrian's Wall and pick up the Rhine, that great gray river forming the empire's northern boundary in Europe. Follow it south to where it meets the Danube. Follow the Danube east through the Balkans into the northern fringe of the Black Sea. From there, pick up the contested boundary with the Parthian Empire running through modern Turkey and Syria and Iraq. Then south through the deserts of Arabia and along the northern edge of the Sahara all the way back to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. That line is approximately 5,000 kilometers long. It required tens of thousands of soldiers to man, and the men who lived their entire military careers along its length, who built its forts and watchtowers and roads, who patrolled in every weather the ancient world could produce, who fought the endless skirmishes and large campaigns that characterized frontier life. These men were the border legions, among the most remarkable soldiers the ancient world ever produced. The frontier experience shaped its soldiers in ways fundamentally different from experience elsewhere in the empire. A Praetorian guardsman lived in Rome, surrounded by civilization, comfort, and political intrigue. But a legionary stationed on the Danubian frontier, in a fort built by his predecessors' hands in a land of cold forests and vast plains, was something different. He was a specialist in a very specific kind of war, the constant grinding attritional warfare of the border, where the enemy was not a massed army that could be brought to battle and defeated in a single decisive engagement, but a dispersed, mobile threat appearing anywhere, along thousands of kilometers of frontier, striking and vanishing before any organized response could reach them. The legions of the Rhine-Danube frontier, stationed in Germania, Raetia, Noricum, Pannonia, Moesia, and Dacia, became the empire's most experienced combat soldiers over the course of the imperial period. While the Praetorians softened in their comfortable barracks, the frontier legions fought, not continuously in pitched battle, but constantly in the sense of maintained combat readiness, regular skirmishing, and periodic large-scale campaigns. They developed a culture distinct from the rest of the Roman military, harder, more insular, more directly connected to the realities of violence. When emperors needed reliable soldiers for major campaigns, they turned to the frontier legions. When the crisis of the 3rd century fractured the empire into competing regional powers, it was frontier legion commanders who wielded real power. The architecture of the Roman frontier is itself a testament to the extraordinary organizational capacity of the border legions. The limes, the system of roads, forts, watchtowers, signal stations, and physical barriers constituting the empire's defensive perimeter, was built almost entirely by soldier labor. Every Roman fort was designed to a standardized pattern that any trained legionary could recognize and defend, even if he had never set foot in that particular installation before. The Principia, the headquarters building, the Praetorium, the commander's residence, the Horea, the granaries, the barracks blocks arranged in their precise rows, the bathhouses, always the bathhouses, because Roman soldiers bathed regularly, and the bathhouse was both hygienic infrastructure and social center. The whole complex, surrounded by ditches and ramparts and walls, connected by roads that legionary feet had leveled and maintained, the road connected to the next road, all the way back to Rome. The frontier legions were also, paradoxically, among the most culturally diverse communities in the ancient world. Soldiers recruited locally from Germanic, Dacian, and Sarmatian populations that lived near the frontier brought their own languages and religious traditions into the fabric of Roman military life. The gods worshipped in a Rhenish frontier fort might include Jupiter Optimus Maximus, of course, but also Mithras, the Persian mystery deity whose cult swept through the military in the 2nd century CE, and Epona, the Celtic horse goddess, and any number of local deities whose names appear on votive altars found during modern archaeological excavations. These men had been drawn from across the known world to stand together on the edge of empire, and the sacred spaces they built reflected every mile of that journey. The German frontier produced some of the most intense, sustained military experience in the Roman world. The disaster of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE, when the general Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 legions into an ambush prepared by the Germanic chieftain Arminius, losing perhaps 15,000 soldiers in 3 days of catastrophic defeat in the dense German interior, cast a shadow over Roman frontier policy that lasted for generations. The legions destroyed there, Legio XVII, Legio XVIII, Legio XIX, were never reconstituted. Their numbers were retired permanently, a mark of shame the Roman military maintained for the rest of its existence. Augustus reportedly spent the rest of his life waking in the night, crying out for Varus to return his legions. The response to Teutoburg shaped everything that followed. The Rhine became effectively a permanent boundary. Projects of Germanic conquest were abandoned. The legions pulled back to the river, built their forts, and committed themselves to the long, patient work of frontier management, preventing large-scale Germanic incursion while conducting punitive raids across the river to demonstrate continued offensive capability. It was managed deterrence rather than conquest. It required different skills, different virtues. The legions deployed along the Danube faced a different set of challenges from their Rhine counterparts. The Danubian frontier was longer, more geographically complex, and threatened by a more diverse array of enemies. The Dacians, the Sarmatians, the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns. Over the course of the imperial period, the Danube frontier faced pressure from an extraordinary variety of peoples, each with their own military traditions, their own strengths, their own tactical approaches. The legions of the Danube became expert in a kind of flexible, adaptive warfare that required them to shift their tactical approach constantly as the nature of the threat evolved. The Dacian Wars of Trajan, conducted in 101 to 102 CE and 105 to 106 CE, depicted in spiral relief on Trajan's column in Rome, represented the Danubian legions at their finest. The Dacian kingdom under Decebalus was a formidable adversary with its own weapons tradition, including the terrifying falx, a curved two-handed blade designed to get over or around the top edge of a Roman shield and strike at the helmet and shoulders of the sheltering soldier. Trajan's campaigns required genuine operational art, the coordination of multiple columns, a newly constructed bridge across the Danube to maintain supply lines, the systematic reduction of Dacian fortified positions. The legions that accomplished it were professionals of the highest order. Along the eastern frontier, the legions faced the empire's most dangerous state-level adversary, the Parthians, then the Sassanid Persians. This frontier was categorically different from the Rhine and Danube. It was a geopolitical competition between two empire-level powers, each capable of fielding armies of enormous size. The Parthians and their successors had cataphracts, cavalry in which both horse and rider were armored, creating a shock weapon of tremendous power, and horse archers of extraordinary skill. The legions that faced them had to develop countermeasures, their own heavy cavalry, their own horse archers drawn from eastern populations, fortifications capable of withstanding siege equipment, and the particular discipline required to face cataphract charges in a tight lock testudo formation without breaking. The border legions in all their regional varieties shared one thing in common that separated them from the rest of the Roman military world. They knew what they were defending, not in the abstract patriotic sense, though that too, probably, for most of them, but in the immediate physical, visceral sense. Beyond the frontier wall, beyond the river, beyond the last watchtower, lay the edge of the Roman world. The darkness, literal and metaphorical, that empire held at bay. Every one of these men knew that what stood between the civilized provinces behind them and whatever lay beyond was themselves. Their bodies, their training, their discipline, their willingness to hold their position when everything in them was urging flight. That knowledge creates a particular kind of soldier, one who does not need to be inspired in the way that soldiers facing an unfamiliar threat must be inspired, one who has already made his peace with what he is, one who gets up every morning and does his job not in a blaze of martial heroism, but in the gray, determined, professional way of men who understand that their work is permanent and that its importance is not diminished by its routine. Rome's real shields, not the Praetorians' glittering ceremonial shields, gold, scorpion, pomp, the real shields, dented and scratched, heavy with use, maintained through long habit, raised every morning against whatever the frontier brought. We have spoken of enemies, of the Germanic tribesmen across the Rhine, the Parthian cataphract on the Euphrates, the Gallic resistance fighter in northern forests, the Dacian warrior with his terrible curving blade. We have spoken of Rome's instruments for dealing with external threats, the guards, the veterans, the specialists, the frontier soldiers. But one more category must be addressed before our portrait is complete: the terror from within, Rome's systems of military punishment, and the units created to exercise it. The Roman military was built on discipline, not merely as an organizational principle or cultural value, but as a genuine philosophical commitment. The Romans believed, with conviction backed by centuries of experience, that disciplina was the foundation upon which everything else rested. Brave men, properly organized, defeat braver men without organization. Skilled fighters in a cohesive formation defeat more skilled fighters operating as individuals. The mathematical logic of disciplined collective action overcame the arithmetic of individual capability. But discipline requires enforcement, and enforcement in a military context means punishment. Rome's approach to military punishment was extraordinary in its severity, its creativity, and its unabashed willingness to use collective violence against its own soldiers as a tool of institutional control. Decimation. The word has entered English as a synonym for widespread destruction, which tells you something about the impression it left on historical memory. but the original practice was something more specific and more philosophically disturbing than general slaughter. When a Roman unit had committed collective cowardice or mutiny, abandoned its position, refused orders, broken and fled, the soldiers assembled and drew lots. Every 10th man, regardless of individual record, bravery, rank, or years of service, was executed by the other 9, beaten to death with clubs or fists by his comrades, by the men who had shared his tent and his rations and his march. The men doing the killing were not outside executioners. They were the survivors. Men who happened, through pure chance, to draw a lot saying they would live. The punishment was designed not just to kill 1 in 10, but to shatter the social fabric of the unit, to force men to kill their friends, to take collective responsibility for collective failure, to destroy the bonds of comradeship and replace them with something colder, more purely functional, built on the understanding that failure could come for any of them regardless of personal merit. Decimated units were afterward placed at the rear of the order of march, a position of shame where they received supplies last and entered camp last. They were denied tents, forced to camp outside the fortified perimeter, fed barley rather than wheat, a symbolic degradation since barley was considered inferior to the wheat-based diet of proper soldiers. The stigma was designed to be permanent. Everyone in the army knew who they were, what had happened to them, and why. The last recorded general use of decimation was during the Second Punic War, when Roman armies faced repeated catastrophic defeats at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, and required extraordinary measures to maintain discipline. Crassus reportedly used it against soldiers who had fled Spartacus's slave army. The very rarity of its use may have been part of its power, a punishment so severe that its mere possibility shaped behavior in ways routine measures could not. Decimation was the nuclear option. Day-to-day discipline operated through lesser but no less revealing punishments. The fustuarium, death by beating inflicted by fellow soldiers on a man convicted of falling asleep on guard duty, stealing from a comrade, or cowardice, was more routinely employed. The condemned man was touched on the head by the tribune with a staff, a ritual act of condemnation, and the unit was released to beat him to death. Even if the man survived through the soldier's choice to pull their punches, he was expelled and barred from returning to his home province, a form of permanent exile considered barely better than death in Roman social terms. For lesser offenses, the Roman military had a graduated scale from financial penalties through physical punishment to humiliation. Rome was extraordinarily creative about humiliation. Soldiers could be made to stand outside headquarters in their tunics without weapons or armor, while comrades marched past. They could be required to perform surveying tasks associated with the lowest grade of military responsibility. They could be assigned the most degrading labor, cleaning latrines, collecting refuse, performing the tasks that slaves performed in civilian life. The point was the same as decimation, scaled down in intensity. The Roman military understood that its soldiers' most powerful motivator was not pay or patriotism, but the opinion of the unit, the judgment of men who slept in the next bunk and held the shields on either side of yours. Honor, shame, the desire to be respected by the men whose respect you lived inside every day. The punishments weaponized that desire. They made shame into a form of violence more dreaded than physical pain. They created a culture in which the worst possible outcome was not death. Romans could be surprisingly philosophical about death, but the contempt of your comrades. There was another dimension to Rome's punishment apparatus beyond the treatment of its own soldiers. Certain units were organized specifically for the work of inflicting organized suffering as a tool of state power. The frumentarii, originally the army's grain supply officers, evolved over the imperial period into something more sinister, a network of military agents combining logistical function with intelligence gathering, law enforcement, and the execution of imperial will across the empire's vast geography. They moved through the empire's road networks, using the hospitality due military personnel, collecting information, carrying orders, and when necessary, performing the tasks that emperors needed performed but could not be seen to directly command. The stationarii, military policemen stationed at key nodes in the road network, represented another face of internal enforcement. They combined genuine public safety functions with the surveillance apparatus of an autocratic state. Soldiers turned inward, deployed against the empire's own population. And at the end of the enforcement chain were the executioners, the carnifices, whose work was the physical machinery behind Rome's capacity for public execution. The crucifixions lining roads outside Roman cities as warnings, the beheadings, the arena deaths that were judicial process as much as entertainment. They were the end point of Roman disciplinary power. What made all of this genuinely terrifying, not merely dangerous or violent, but psychologically catastrophic, was its systematic character. Rome's punishment apparatus, like its military and administrative apparatus, was not improvised or arbitrary. It was organized. It had rules. It had procedures. It had institutional memory and professional expertise. The Romans had thought carefully about pain and shame and death as tools of social control, and they built institutions deploying these tools with the same methodical efficiency they brought to road construction or legal codification. An enemy who could be defeated was frightening, but a system, vast, organized, relentless, reaching across thousands of kilometers of empire, with procedures for every contingency, refined over centuries of practice. That was something else. That was genuinely terrifying, because systems, unlike armies, cannot be defeated by a single victory. They must be dismantled. And dismantling Rome's system of disciplinary control required dismantling Rome itself, which is, in the end, what happened. Over the long centuries of the empire's decline, as the system frayed under the pressure of external barbarian incursion and internal fragmentation and economic collapse and epidemic disease, and the gradual dissolution of the institutional culture that had held it all together, Rome's capacity to maintain discipline over its armies, over its populations, over itself, eroded. The punishments continued, but they lost their meaning. The executions continued, but they lost their deterrent power. The machinery kept running, but the spirit that had animated it, the absolute collective commitment to disciplina as the foundation of civilization, was gone. And without that spirit, Rome was already falling, even before the first barbarian king sat on a Roman throne. Rome held these contradictions in tension for centuries. The sheer organizational capacity of the Roman system, its ability to absorb, direct, and channel enormous amounts of human violence toward productive imperial ends, was the greatest administrative achievement of the ancient world. That it eventually failed, that the tensions proved irresolvable, that the instruments of terror ultimately turned inward and contributed to the dissolution of the system that had created them. This is not a story of failure. It is a story about the fundamental nature of power. Power is never simply possessed. It is always simultaneously exercised and threatened. The Roman legions terrified the ancient world because Rome had found, for a remarkable span of centuries, the mechanisms to direct that power outward, toward the world's periphery, toward enemies, toward rebellious provinces. When those mechanisms failed, the empire did not simply dissolve, it turned on itself, and the most terrifying soldiers of the ancient world became the agents of their own civilization's unraveling. The Praetorians in their sculpted breastplates, the gray-haired veterans who refused to lay down their arms, the Batavian swimmers and the Syrian archers and the Numidian horsemen, the frontier legionaries who spent their lives on the edge of the known world, the enforcers and executioners who made the machinery of Roman discipline real in the bodies of its subjects. They were not simply soldiers. They were the living expression of what a civilization becomes when it commits itself, fully and without reservation, to organized violence as the ultimate foundation of order.